Good evening from Ottawa, and thank you for joining us for this Cardus Religious Freedom Institute webinar, Mao versus God, State Control of Churches in China under Xi. I'm Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, the director of the Cardus Religious Freedom Institute. The Institute exists as part of Cardus, Canada's faith-based think tank. The Institute exists to acknowledge the good of religion within our common life as citizens. We accomplish this through undertaking emerging scholarship, facilitating public discussion, and engaging our country's democratic institutions on the fundamental character of religious freedom to our citizenship. This evening's webinar will examine the current grave persecution taking place in China under Premier Xi Jinping, which is systematically violating the religious freedom of Chinese Christians through the destruction and conversion of church buildings, imprisonment of pastors and priests, and the coercion of Christians to announce their faith. This comes in addition to the brutal repression already underway of the religious freedom of Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and Falun Gong practitioners. So what is the extent of this persecution and what motivates it? This is one of the questions we'll explore this evening, as well as how is what is happening to Christians in China affecting Canadian Christians of a Chinese background? Please join the Cardus Religious Freedom Institute tonight, along with our special guests, including two leading commentators on religious freedom in China, to explore this question. To help us navigate this topic, I'm joined this evening by my friend and a good friend of Cardus, David Sweet, the Member of Parliament for Flamborough-Glanbrook, who in a minute will introduce our main speakers, David Mulrooney and Benedict Rogers. David Sweet was first elected to the House of Commons in 2006 and has sat in the House of Commons as a member of the Conservative Caucus since that time. He served as Conservative Caucus Chair during the 42nd Parliament that ended in 2019. He has served in a variety of parliamentary roles, including as Vice Chair of the Public Accounts Committee and as Chair of both the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology and the Standing Committee on Veterans Affairs. A strong advocate for human rights both inside and outside of Parliament, David sat on the Human Rights Committee of the House of Commons for 14 years, during which time he spoke out passionately on human rights issues in Tibet, Iran and Iraq, and in many other parts of the world. David is a founding member of the Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism. David, it's a pleasure to have you with us this evening. I welcome you to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. It's an honor to be part of Cardus Religious Freedom Institute this event. And I want to get to our speakers very quickly, but I want to hearken back to just before I was elected, and I was hoping to be able to serve our country in this capacity. And I was with Stockwell Day, and he made this assertion that freedom of religion is the highest order of freedom and rights. He said, because from it, every other freedom and religion, every other freedom and right streams from that very thing. Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of religion and worship. And whether you agree with that proposition or not, it's very poignant in our discussion for this evening. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest, and that is David Mulrooney. And let me give you some details, and I'm certain that many of you are familiar with his public reputation. David Mulrooney spent more than 30 years in Canadian Foreign Service. He ran Canada's office in Taiwan from 1998 to 2001 and served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2009 to 2012. After returning to Canada, he served from 2015 to 2018 as President and Vice Chancellor of the University of St. Michael's College, the Catholic University federated with the University of Toronto. Mr. Mulrooney is a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. His book about Canada-China relations, Middle Power, Middle Kingdom, was awarded the J.W. Defoe Prize for 2016. Mr. Mulrooney, thank you very much for your service to Canada, and you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, David. And it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to discuss something so important, notably the assault on religious freedom that has characterized Xi Jinping's China. Let me say at the outset that my own direct experience of China precedes the Xi era, although I did meet Xi himself a couple of times as he was making his way up through the system. So allow me to step back a bit and consider the state of religious freedom such as it was prior to the Xi era, before going on to consider why we should be so deeply concerned about what's happening under Xi, who is now both president and party leader. I'll begin by sharing my belief that two of the characteristics that mark Xi's approach to religion, a profound lack of understanding and a xenophobic insistence on sinicizing religion, making it more patriotically Chinese, have a Communist Party pedigree that precedes and predates Xi, although under his enthusiastic direction, the consequences are more brutal and more deeply threatening to believers. I arrived in China as ambassador in the late summer of 2009. From the outset, I saw support for religious freedom as a central objective of the human rights program at the embassy and of my own work as ambassador. I was encouraged in this by the very welcome priority that the government of the day brought to the issue, and David, you referenced this in your opening remarks, making it clear that religious freedom is a Canadian value, enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that belongs to everyone, everywhere. This policy clarity upset some in the department who were unhappy about the inclusion of religious belief among the human rights that they were called to defend. They criticized support for religious freedom as an unfair and partisan intervention on behalf of one of two perspectives that deserved equal respect from an impartial Canada. The other perspective was typically described as, quote, the freedom not to believe, unquote. It was as if we were trying to impose on countries like China a specific religious perspective, rather than simply trying to ensure that people in China weren't tortured or imprisoned simply for having a religious perspective. Having seen how ruthlessly China suppresses both faith and faithful, I've never been particularly worried about whether the freedom not to believe is imperiled there. I'll come back to the Canadian side of the story later, but let me simply assert that you're unlikely to defend religious freedom abroad if you don't respect it at home. Our work in support of religious freedom showed us the less polished side of China's diplomacy, the side that was normally hidden in those days before wolf warriors were let off the leash. I saw how tense and insecure official China is when it comes to matters relating to faith, and how little understanding, much less sympathy, communist bureaucrats have for matters of the spirit. This profound gulf in understanding and experience, widened by decades of anti-religious propaganda, has bred ignorance, intolerance, and even fear of religion. I had to struggle tenaciously to visit even a few temples and monasteries when I was finally, grudgingly, allowed access to Tibet. In Xinjiang, in China's far west, I was followed for an entire day by a car full of thugs. This effort at intimidation was triggered by my meeting, without seeking permission, members of China's Ismaili Muslim community, who are cut off from their spiritual leader, the Aga Khan. I was given a public dressing down by my Chinese government handler when I insisted on keeping my appointment at a Catholic seminary that was being harassed by Communist Party officials. I avoided such histrionics when I attended a service at a Protestant house church only because I didn't bother to seek permission beforehand, knowing that it wouldn't have been granted. I had numerous conversations with officials from SARA, the State Administration of Religious Affairs. Actually, they weren't conversations so much as lectures, with my host often claiming 55 of the 60 minutes allotted for our meeting. These sessions serve to reinforce my sense that the professional formation of Chinese officials renders them incapable of understanding religion as anything other than a superstition, but one that has sufficient motivating power to be a threat to the party. This perception is reinforced if the religion is Christianity, which, despite having roots in China that are 1,000 years old, is almost always referred to as foreign, colonial, and sinister, ignoring the outsized impact that Christian missionaries in China have had on the introduction of healthcare, education, and other modern social services. The clear intent of policy is to reduce religious belief to a cultural practice that is completely controlled, as is all cultural practice in China, by the party, It must also be thoroughly Sinicized, which really means not just making it more Chinese, but more in line with the party's priorities. In my experience, the three religions that the party fears most are those whose headwaters lie beyond China's borders and are thus hardest to drain of a separate and independent spiritual energy. These are Islam, Tibetan Buddhism, and Catholicism. While there's a strong element of continuity in China's official antagonism to religion, the approach has not been uniform over time. The anti-religious extremism of the Cultural Revolution was followed by a gradual increase in tolerance in the early 1990s and 2000s, something that was also true of most other aspects of Chinese life, with the party's bloody campaign against the Falun Gong representing a notable and tragic exception. A major rationale for relaxing controls on religion was China's belief that it needed foreign support to power its economic revolution, a perception that dramatically diminished as Western nations were laid low by the economic crisis of 2008. Indeed, from 2008 onwards, President Hu Jintao's regime was notable for its growing hostility to religion. This was tragically illustrated by a brutal government response to demonstrations in Tibet in 2008, and in the wake of communal violence in Xinjiang in 2009. Unrest in both places was triggered by legitimate local fears of religious and cultural assimilation. And in both cases, the crackdowns targeted belief and believers. The most formidable Chinese military presence I saw in Xinjiang just after the riots was a ring of armed troops and military vehicles that surrounded the great Idka Mosque in Kashgar. When I visited Tibet, I was appalled to encounter menacing armed patrols forcing their way against the flow of pilgrims circling the Jokhang Temple, the holiest site in Tibetan Buddhism. Let me turn briefly to what I think has been happening recently. Religious persecution has deepened and darkened under Xi Jinping. Even as the decades-long assault on Tibet continues, and as Christian churches topple, China is showing us something new in Xinjiang, the awesome power of the 21st century surveillance state. It is chilling in its scope, ambition, and efficiency as Muslim holy places, scripture, music, cultural practices, even traditions of family life are methodically eradicated, while Xinjiang itself is transformed into a vast prison camp. China is writing the textbook for religious persecution in the 21st century. In addition to the futuristic application of advanced technology, we're also seeing in Xinjiang and elsewhere the insertion of party leader Xi Jinping into religious liturgy and iconography. This mirrors what's happening in the party and in broader society. Not so long ago, a more moderate party, one that was embracing consensus-based decision-making and a predictable, peaceful process for leadership transition, also tolerated a degree of ambiguity about who occupies the Holy of Holies in churches, mosques, and temples. But as Xi consolidates his unquestioned personal authority, the pressure grows to enshrine him in the mysterious space at the pinnacle of each religion, the place reserved for God alone. Let me close by making a couple of final points. The first is that there is almost certainly an overseas dimension to China's efforts to suppress religious freedom. We need to understand that the party seeks to infiltrate and corrupt any activity, cause, or belief system at home or abroad that attracts target communities. When shared religious belief brings members of the Chinese diaspora or Tibetans or Uyghurs together in Canada, it offers the party an opportunity for infiltration, for surveillance, for influence operations, and for intimidation. My second point has to do with why our own government has been less than resolute when it comes to speaking up about religious persecution in China. There are, I think, a couple of reasons. The first is simply bad diplomacy, the notion that you can advance a cause by not speaking honestly about it. that China will somehow moderate its behavior in exchange for our silence, rather than shrewdly equating our silence with consent. The silent treatment never works with China. I believe that it is precisely such colossally naive diplomacy that is at the heart of the Vatican's disastrous China policy, on which it is now sadly doubling down. But there's more to Canada's disinclination to speak out. Our present government has been, in my opinion, at best indifferent when it comes to religious freedom here at home. When, in 2016, the government eliminated the Office of Religious Freedom, the announcement was delivered with a hint of the secular disapproval I referenced earlier, as if an undeserved benefit was finally being withdrawn. What's hardest to understand is that this happened as we were witnessing increasingly violent attacks on religious believers in China, Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. The next year, we endured an inexplicably offensive anti-religious rant from the Governor General. Strangely, when the Prime Minister finally spoke about the controversy, it was to defend his appointee, not the millions of Canadians she had offended. In 2017, we also witnessed a clumsy attempt to require organizations applying for summer jobs funding to attest that their core mandate respects abortion. Although this failed, religious organizations continue to worry, justifiably, about respect for conscience rights. They watch anxiously as the government broadens the availability of euthanasia by redefining promised safeguards as impediments and steadily sweeping them away. This is deeply troubling. Perhaps those in power in this country can no longer summon the required reserves of understanding, tolerance, and mutual respect that allow religious belief to flourish. What is clear is that Canadians are unlikely to champion religious freedom in China or anywhere if we don't respect it everywhere, Canada included. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mulrooney. I appreciate your comments. There is an aspect of a spirit of intellectual discounting of those religious beliefs in Canada, and I think you hit the nail on the head. And I also appreciate your observation of Xi Jinping being the one who should abide in the Holy of Holies. You know, there's a mystic historical tradition in China that the Yellow Emperor just showed up, and that's how China began. And I sometimes think that Xi thinks that he may be today's Yellow Emperor. Thank you very much for your very great comments. Now we'll move on to our next extraordinary guest, Benedict Rogers. And Benedict Rogers is a human rights activist and writer specializing in Asia. He is the co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch, senior analyst for East Asia and the International Human Rights Organization, CSW, co-founder and deputy chair of the UK Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, a member of the advisory group of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC, and a member of the advisory group for the Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign. He's the author of 6 books, a regular speaker around the world, and has testified at hearings in the Canadian Parliament, the United States Congress, the UK Parliament, the European Parliament, the Japanese Parliament, and the United Nations. He's also a regular contributor to international media, including BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, the Wall Street Journal, the Spectator Foreign Policy, the Diplomat, Apple Daily, Hong Kong Free Press, the Tablet, and the list goes on. And I would be remiss if I didn't say to you, Mr. Benedict Rogers, that you have a hearty welcome in respect to my colleague, Garrett Genuis. And so we look forward to your remarks. Please go ahead. You take the floor now, Mr. Rogers.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Sweet. And it's a great privilege to share this very distinguished panel. And I really appreciated David Mulrooney's remarks. And in many ways, and I guess this is inevitable with a topic like this, some of my remarks will echo and reinforce some of what he has said, although I'll try not to duplicate unnecessarily. I thought I ought to just start, though, by saying that 2 of the very few positive things that have come out of the tragedy of the COVID-19 pandemic this year are firstly the fact that we've all moved into this Zoom era of having communications around the world in ways that we didn't previously have. I just came from a webinar in Cardiff in Wales from this very seat, where speaking on a similar topic to do with China with a Uyghur speaker, a Hong Kong activist, and the chair of the UK House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. And so I'm delighted to have gone from Cardiff to Canada within just a few minutes. And the second positive thing that's come from this pandemic is this awakening of consciousness about China. I think a few years ago, I was regarded, at least in Britain, as quite a nuisance and a sort of marginal irritation by raising human rights concerns about China. And now the mood in the British Parliament and the media and the public has shifted enormously, I think, because of the evidence of what's happening to the Uyghurs, because of what's happened to Hong Kong, because of the pandemic and the way the Chinese regime handled the pandemic at the very beginning, and also, of course, the debate about Huawei and other issues that relate to our national security. So that has to be welcomed, although I wish it hadn't taken a pandemic to wake people up. Just to give a little bit of context for my remarks, I first went to China when I was 18 years old, to the city of Qingdao on the East Coast as part of my year between high school and university. And I went to teach English in Qingdao for 6 months. I went back several times during my summers as a student. And I've really been in and around China for the past 25 years or more, although for the past few years, I haven't been able to go to China because in October 2017, I was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing. And so I'm pretty sure that if I can't go to Hong Kong, I certainly can't go into the mainland. But I did my master's at the School of Oriental and African Studies, actually on the very topic that we're looking at tonight, the question of the Chinese Communist Party's policy towards religion. And I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover from 1997 to 2002. And I would say that if I look back at that period of time of involvement with China, China today is going through what I would describe as the worst crackdown on human rights as a whole since the Tiananmen massacre, and the worst assault on religious freedom specifically since the Cultural Revolution. Our topic today is rightly state control of churches in China under Xi, and I will stick to that topic, but I think it's worth emphasizing, as has already been said in the introductory remarks, that I think this should be seen in the context of what increasingly is being regarded as a genocide of the Uyghurs, the repression of Tibet, and the persecution of Falun Gong. And the organization that I've worked for full-time for the last more than 15 years and still have a part-time role with, CSW, has documented this particularly in a very comprehensive report published earlier this year, titled Repressed, Removed and Re-educated, the Stranglehold on Religious Life in China Today. But to turn to the specific situation of the churches and Christianity, what has happened? Well, as David Mulroney has already outlined, the Chinese Communist Party has always been hostile to religion in general and Christianity in particular. I would say for three primary reasons. Firstly, ideological, because it is an atheist ideology that opposes religion for ideological reasons. Secondly, as David has said, it regards Christianity in particular as a foreign religion, despite its long history in China. And thirdly, that it is nervous of anything that it doesn't control, of any gathering of people, particularly gathering of large numbers of people that it feels threatened by. And it has, through its history, gone through several phases. The initial attempt to eliminate Christianity, drive it underground during the Cultural Revolution. Then the process of control through the early 1980s, recognizing that it couldn't eliminate it, but wanted to control it. And then I would argue a period of some relative relaxation, never total relaxation, but some comparative relaxation, and moving now under Xi Jinping to a period of severe repression and also attempts at co-option. One of the things that's very noticeable under Xi Jinping is how the policy is now determined at the center. I think that it's fair to say that before Xi Jinping, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, the policy or at least the implementation of the policy towards churches really did vary from province to province and city to city, depending to a large. Some provinces were notoriously hardline and harsh. Others were notoriously more relaxed, and provided churches didn't meet in large numbers or too visibly, they could usually continue to gather. But under Xi Jinping, and particularly since 2016, the Chinese regime has launched a campaign that has included several national level conferences on religion, led by, or at least attended by, Xi Jinping, and an effort to sinicize, in inverted commas, religion. On the 1st of February 2018, revised regulations on religious affairs came into effect, resulting in much tighter restrictions on Christians. And in recent years, we've seen the destruction of, including even the dynamiting of churches, the destruction of thousands of crosses, the closure of many churches, and the arrest of pastors. I think notably of the cases of the Livingstone Church in Guizhou, the Early Rain Church in Chengdu, and in June this year, the Xinguang Church in Xiamen. We've seen the arrest and imprisonment of pastors like Pastor Wang Yi just after Christmas this year, and Pastor Zhao Huiguo from the Bethel Church in Hunan in April this year. And that's on the Protestant church side. We've seen a continuing assault on the Catholic Church as well. Father Su Guipeng remains under house arrest. The coadjutor Bishop Augustine Cui Tai of Xuanhua, a 70-year-old bishop, was arrested earlier this year. And in both Protestant and Catholic state-controlled churches, we've seen a much more blatant move by the Chinese Communist Party to instill its propaganda and imagery in churches. Many cases of both churches and even Christian family homes being asked to at least display portraits of Xi Jinping and other communist leaders alongside religious imagery, and in some cases even replace the religious imagery with such portraits. We've seen CCP propaganda banners being displayed in churches, the introduction of surveillance cameras at the altar to monitor those who are attending, the prohibition of people under the age of 18 from worshipping. And we've seen also at least the talk and the beginnings of an attempt to, believe it or not, rewrite the Bible. The Chinese Communist Party is talking about producing a new version of the Bible. In fact, the chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, Wang Yang, the body that oversees ethnic and religious affairs, said in a meeting in November last year that he called for a, quote, a comprehensive evaluation of existing religious classics, aiming at contents which do not conform to the progress of the times. These books should be rewritten to, quote, reflect socialist values. And we've seen some reports in recent weeks of what some of the extracts of the CCP's version of the Bible might look like, where they've totally distorted and misrepresented some of the key biblical stories. Bishop John Fang Xingpao, the president of the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association, the body that is the Chinese regime's approved in inverted commas, Catholic body, says these words, speaking on behalf of the government, or at least the official body: love for homeland must be greater than love for the church, and the law of the country is above canon law. And I think that when he talks about homeland, he's not talking about love for his country, he's talking about the party state. Let me draw towards a close by just commenting in a little bit more detail. David's already touched on it briefly, but on the renewal of the Vatican's agreement with China. And I speak quite personally on this because I became a Catholic 7 years ago, and I became a Catholic not in my local parish in Britain, but actually in the cathedral in Yangon or Rangoon in Burma, Myanmar. So I became a Catholic at least in China's backyard, as it were. And I didn't come into the Catholic Church in order to take on the Vatican. That was never my idea. And I also came into the Catholic Church in large part because I was drawn by Catholic social teaching and particularly the Church's teaching on religious freedom and human rights. And when the Vatican-China agreement was first made 2 years ago, I was cautious and careful about not being overly critical about it. I did have some concerns about it, but I thought, well, let's see whether my concerns are proven wrong. And in the 2 years of the provisional agreement, perhaps we may see some progress. And if we do, I'm ready to revise my view. But when we look at the 2 years since it was signed, in my view, it has achieved none of the objectives that it was designed to. It was designed, I presume, to better protect the religious freedom, at least of Catholics initially, and ideally, one would hope, religious freedom for all. And yet, not only has religious freedom as a whole been even more repressed, but there's been no improvement in the lives of Catholics. In fact, we've seen more Catholics arrested since the agreement. We've seen, to my knowledge, no Catholic clergy who were in prison before the agreement was reached released as a result of the agreement. And in my view, a basic precondition for such an agreement should have been to negotiate the release of those who were in prison. But I think there are also 4 other reasons to be concerned about the automatic renewal of this agreement. The first is that the document itself remains a secret document. The full text of the agreement is not known to us. It was not even made known to Cardinal Joseph Zen, the emeritus Bishop of Hong Kong, one of the few Chinese cardinals who is in freedom and who would have had both the knowledge and experience and the freedom of conscience to comment honestly on it. Of course, that hasn't stopped him speaking out about what he does know, but the text itself remains secret. And I would say, if it is a good deal, why can't we all see what's in it? I also have concerns about the timing of it coming, as I've described, at a time when we're seeing the worst assault on religious freedom since the Cultural Revolution. I think that one of the objectives was, I presume, to try to unite the church in China, but I would say that the effect has been to further divide and to create a sense on the part of many of those in the unregistered church who have stayed loyal to Rome at great risk to themselves for decades. It's created for them a sense of betrayal and bewilderment. And lastly, and perhaps most significantly, and I don't say this at all lightly, and I say it with a heavy heart, but I fear that it has brought the Vatican's and even so far Pope Francis's silence on these issues. Pope Francis is a pope who is known almost every Sunday when he prays the Angelus in St. Peter's Square to pray for and speak out about an issue of injustice in the one part of the world or another pretty much every week. But the one country that he has, to my knowledge, said nothing about, not even to express a prayer for, is China. He hasn't said anything about the Uyghurs or Tibet or Hong Kong or the persecution of Christians. In contrast to many of his predecessors, he's not met with the Dalai Lama, and I think most of his predecessors did meet with the Dalai Lama, and that is very concerning. And I think if that is allowed to continue long term, then it has serious implications for his own moral authority, and increasingly people are noticing that. The agreement has also is already starting to have an impact on Hong Kong and on religious freedom in Hong Kong. Tragically, not seemingly directly from the authorities, but actually from within the diocese in Hong Kong itself, which is instructing clergy to be careful in their homilies, instructing lay Catholics to withdraw public prayer campaigns about Hong Kong's freedoms, and various other examples. And I'm happy to say more on that in the discussion and the Q&A. I just may end with two final points. As well as looking at the impact on churches themselves, we should also not forget the repression of human rights defenders and human rights lawyers, many of whom are Christians themselves or have been defending the rights of Christians. And there was 10 years or so ago a certain amount of space for them to operate. I remember being in Beijing about 10 years ago and meeting a group of human rights lawyers in a restaurant where they talked relatively openly, relatively freely. Of course, they knew where the boundaries were. They knew there were restrictions, but within those boundaries, they had a certain amount of space to defend cases of Christians and others. And now almost all of those lawyers that I met 10 years ago have either disappeared, been jailed, disbarred, or are in prison. And when we're thinking about religious freedom in China, we should remember those, whether they were Christian human rights defenders or human rights defenders defending Christians, they're part of the picture as well. Let me close finally with two quotes, which are both very striking because they echo each other, but they're coming from two different parts of the world. The United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, said this last year. It seems that the Chinese government is at war with faith, but it's a war that they will not win. The Chinese Communist Party must hear the cry of its people for religious freedom. And then finally, the words which echo that, but words that poignantly come from Pastor Wang Yi of the Early Rain Church, who was sentenced to 10 years in jail just after Christmas. And he said these words: the Chinese Communist Party is launching a war against the soul. In Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Chengdu, the rulers of this country are launching this war, but they have established for themselves an enemy that can never be detained, can never be destroyed, will never capitulate nor be conquered, and that is the soul of man. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. And I noticed that both you and Mr. Mulroney mentioned Muslim Uyghurs and Tibetan Buddhists and Falun Gong. And I've noticed in my experience in human rights over the last 14 years that oppressive and tyrannical regimes will never stop with one group of people. And so when we fight for religious freedom, we're not only fight for our own camp, but whenever we fight for anyone, we're fighting for all. And so I just, in your remarks, you made that. I just wanted to point that out specifically. And in regards to your observation about more, broader consciousness in public, we have an award-winning journalist here, Terry Glavin, who has pointed out to me, being in the fight for 10 years, that finally that in the polling in Canadians, it's now up to 80% of Canadians are very concerned with the human rights behavior and the broader behavior of the Chinese Communist Party as well. So thank you very much, both of you gentlemen. I'll now hand it over to Father Deacon Andrew Bennett to continue the conversation on religious freedom in China.
Great, thank you very much, David, and thank you again to David Mulroney and Ben Rogers for your comments. And I want to pick up on a point that David Mulroney made before I introduce our special guest who'll be speaking to us in just a minute, and that is, we often forget, and certainly the Chinese seem to have forgotten, the role that Christians have played in China for the better part of 1,000 years, ever since missionaries from Mesopotamia, from the Assyrian Church of the East, journeyed eastwards along that Silk Road and brought Christianity to China. And then certainly the era of Christian missionary activity in the last number of centuries. And Christians did help to establish healthcare system, educational systems in China. And Christians continue to be active in China in these areas. And I want to introduce one of those Christians, Kevin Garrett, who's a special guest with us on our webinar this evening. Kevin and his wife, Julia, who hail from British Columbia, spent approximately 30 years in China, going there initially in 1984, where they engaged in a wide range of social entrepreneurship and various activities, including ways in which they could manifest their deep Christian faith. And in 2014, both Kevin and Julia were arrested by Chinese authorities as they were living in the northeastern part of China, where they had been for many years doing their good work. And they were arrested, and in Kevin's case, kept for just over 2 years in confinement. Julia was kept for a year, accused of all sorts of activities, including spies. Being spies, it was one of these tit-for-tat situations like we're familiar with now in the case of Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels that are in detention. But I was very happy when a good friend of mine and Kevin and Julia's pastor, Pastor Rich Gao in BC, recommended that we have Kevin on to talk about his understanding of Christianity in China and what Christians are facing in China, given what he and Julia experienced over their 30 years there, working with small Christian communities. And so, Kevin, it's a sincere pleasure for us to have you on our webinar this evening. And the floor is yours. Give us just a few minutes of your reflections on this situation.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate being able to be here. Thank you, Ben Rogers, for your comments, and David Mulroney. I heartily agree with your assessments and what you said and what's going on in China today. I won't touch on any of that, but just to say that I agree. As Dr. Andrew said, we first went to China in '84. We went as Christians. We were Christians. We went to share our faith. That was through teaching English. It later turned into starting a training center, working with an orphanage, and lastly ended with a coffee shop on the border of China and North Korea. Over those years, we met incredible people. Like from village church pastors who we would help with various things and they would thank us by giving us a bag of peanuts or things like that. We met people in city churches who just wanted to really experience God. We taught English actually in a government church for a couple of years, and the government allowed it. And we had, until it got bigger than the church itself. So then then they had to stop it. We started off in a city called Changsha, where Hudson Taylor's last stomping grounds in the early 1900s. And we had incredibly good friends within the Chinese community, Chinese Christian community. Of course, people were cautious. Of course, they were careful. We met in parks, we met quietly, we met in small groups. We very seldom attended what we referred to as underground churches. We shied away from that, but we knew people in them. We would sometimes attend government churches, but you get to be kind of pushed to the front, and we didn't really want that. We mostly worked on the sidelines. And, with what's going on today, crosses being taken down, people being even imprisoned for their faith, pictures being replaced with religious icons or by religious things. I've seen it, we've seen it. Friends of ours who are in China today have told us about churches being closed because, well, one was too close to a university, so they wanted to close it because students were going there. We've seen all of that. And, how do we combat that? Well, it's through prayer. For us, we spent those 2 years in prison, 775 days. And to me, what made the difference was prayer and people praying, and I'm comforted by that. And I know we have to deal with the issues of persecution and repression that's going on in China right now. We have to stand up. We have to address it in the world stage. I know that. But I also know that we have to address it in prayer and realize that God is still sovereign, right? He's not going to change. And I think, I forget who mentioned it, what someone says, they won't win, right? No one will ever win. I think we know when Mao Zedong tried to do this with the church, he didn't win. The church went from less than 1 million in 1949 to estimates are up 70 to 100 million today, or maybe more. And I think we have to realize that too. But again, we still have to do our part. When we were arrested, detained, it wasn't because of our works that we're doing. It wasn't because we were Christians. It was because of a political play, because Canada arrested a Chinese spy, exactly what's happening with the two Michaels right now. So we were taken so that China could have a bargaining chip. Well, that didn't work very well. But what I've encouraged is that even in prison, I met a couple of Christians, and they were, one was kind of wayward, I would say, disillusioned, but he started to come back. I met other people who were in prison who were, they had no hope, and they turned to the Lord. And I was very encouraged by that. And I think, what's going on in China today is, as already been mentioned, is part of a much bigger picture, much bigger plan, because we all know China, Zhongguo, means Middle Kingdom, and China would like to be the center of the attention of the world again. But we can help with that not to happen through our prayer and through our continued action. I think people being in China, we spent those 30 years there. And what I've learned and what I realize is that, Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. God is allowing this right now, as he allowed us to be in prison for 2 years, but he does mean it for good, because I think the church will grow out of this, but we still have to address the issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Really appreciate that insight. And I think that really just reaffirms and confirms what both David and Ben were saying. So thank you again, and really appreciate your presence on our call this evening. I'd now, in just a minute, like to introduce a good friend of mine and fellow cleric in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. But before I do that, I just want to, I was reflecting on this point that what is happening in China, it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for the Chinese Communist Party to wipe out religion. Rabbi David Novak at the University of Toronto is famous for saying that as human beings, we have a metaphysical need. We have a need deep within ourselves, deep within our persons, to know that which is beyond us, to know God. If I can take my own and Father Richard Sue, our own church, the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, which was, for the latter half of the 20th century, the largest illegal church in the world. It was a church that was brutally suppressed by the Soviet regime, in which all of our bishops, instead of signing over church properties, monasteries, seminaries to the Soviet government, they willingly were exiled to the Gulag. And all but one of them died there. And when the church finally came up from the underground, where it had been existing in 1989, 1990, there was, from over 2,000 parishes in 1946, there was one functioning parish in Lviv that was under heavy surveillance. We had lost 90% of our clergy, and the average age of the 300 or so priests that were remaining was in their 60s. Another generation, it would have been done. We had no seminaries. We had no monasteries. And now, some 30 years later, we are back to where we have close to 3,000 parishes. We have a thriving episcopacy in Ukraine. We have the only Catholic university in the former Soviet Union, the Ukrainian Catholic University. We have monasteries. We have thriving monastic communities across the country. And we now have 4 seminaries in which there are around 800 men in formation for religious life and the priesthood. And so I take great courage in that history of the church that I am a part of. It's a church of new martyrs, and it's a church that suffered brutally. And so I'd like to invite Father Richard Su, who is a Jesuit hieromonk, Jesuit priest. It was the parish priest at the Eastern Catholic, deliberately named Eastern Catholic Church in Richmond, British Columbia. And Father Richard, at his parish, he has one community, but many manifestations of it. He has a group of Ukrainian language speakers who serve the Divine Liturgy in Ukrainian, and he has a second Divine Liturgy where there is English and Cantonese and Mandarin. And I remember serving at Father Richard's parish just after I was ordained a deacon in 2017, and I walked in and I heard one of his parishioners praying the third hour on Sunday morning in Cantonese, I believe it was. So, Father Richard, you've had some experience and some interesting experiences of what David Mulroney spoke about the way in which the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party can infiltrate Chinese communities abroad who are supportive of different religious communities. But you've also got a very unique parish and a very unique community embedded there in Richmond, BC. So I'm hoping that you can just take a few minutes and share your perspective on this question and some of your experience.
Thank you, Father Deacon. Perhaps I just start with a disclaimer. I got into this stuff not because I'm ethnically Chinese or my ancestors, my great-grandfather was ethnically Chinese. I don't read Chinese, was terrible in Chinese school. Benedict Rogers, way better in Chinese than I am, because I followed his, his Chinese things. I got connected because of faith and church. Around 2013, the Diocese of Hong Kong asked me to go to give a series of presentations on Byzantine Christianity, because the head of the Liturgical Commission was an Eastern Churchophile and thought that our spirituality would fit the Chinese culture better. So off I went and gave all these wonderful presentations and met people and made friends. And then when I got back and transferred to the Vancouver area to Richmond, very soon after the Maidan protests, the umbrella movement started. And suddenly I got a message from one of my cantors saying, Father Richard, this is Hong Kong now. And the same streets we were on, except now erupted in protest and police brutality and tear gassing people. So suddenly, from someone who wasn't particularly Chinese, except I still like the food, suddenly I was connected and involved. My other cantor got arrested for just showing up at a protest. And so suddenly I could not do nothing about it. And there were local protesters here who were protesting in front of the consulate, majority of whom were Christians and Catholics, but felt no support from the institutional church. So I thought, given my Jesuit background, my liberation theology background, I thought we can't just kind of let them feel abandoned by their church. So we went off as a parish and did a prayer rally. Nice Protestant evangelical way to put it. It was a liturgical protest. And then I also put on an umbrella retreat to explain to people whose hearts and consciences committed them to support freedom in Hong Kong and China with theological and spiritual background, so they wouldn't feel kind of a bifurcation, their heart and their faith. So part of my reward was my bishop, who was there visiting and got the umbrella tour, which I helped to arrange for him. I got this crucifix from the street chapel, from the St. Francis Street Chapel during the Umbrella Revolution, which was, of course, later on destroyed by the police. And if you and Benedict Rogers could probably read the Chinese. The English says, of course, umbrella revolution, and the Chinese apparently says, I want universal suffrage. So this is a great relic in my little parish here. So even after so when I was telling the bishop, I'm warning him, look, I'm going to do this thing. Don't, if you get a complaint. And he says, and this is part of the reason, because he says, no, well, our church can't be just about the Ukraine, because he was at the very start of the big Maidan revolution when the church got involved. He went down to the square. He stood between the student protesters and the riot police. He had me write a petition for prayer in all our little Ukrainian parishes in British Columbia. We were praying for freedom and human rights in Hong Kong all throughout the umbrella movement. So we continue to support freedom in China and in Hong Kong. We had a funeral service for Liu Xiaobao. We had a freedom service for his widow to get his widow out of China. Fast forward to last year, the anti-extradition movement, things suddenly became very hot. And so I helped organize an ecumenical prayer meeting. Every month we would pray, Catholics and Protestants, because a lot of, especially in some churches, felt no support in their home church. They couldn't even speak out, much less pray about freedom in Hong Kong. So we had these wonderful little prayer meetings in a downtown church in Vancouver. Suddenly in August one day, I presume the consulate organized an anti-protest mob, an anti-prayer meeting mob that surrounded our little prayer meeting. We could see them suddenly appear, big Communist China flags going round and round the building, going into the parking lot. They were trying to find us. It was so concerning, the neighbors called the police. And I was thinking, oh no, they're in the parking lot. I left my processional cross in my car. Are they gonna smash the car? Because if you look in, you know that clearly it's the Catholic processional cross. The police had to show up and keep them back. They were trying to take pictures of us to dox us. We had to be escorted like a block away so that we could go home in peace. The Sunday following, someone came to our church, I presume sent by the same crowd, and started taking pictures of all my parishioners, their faces. They were preparing to dox us. So much so that I didn't know what was going on. But when I was told about it, I had to come up with a policy if this happens next time, what to do. So it's quite scary, the way, when we first started in 2014 with the umbrella movement, we felt quite safe. This is Canada, this is Richmond, BC, this is the land of Mackenzie King. So kind of nothing terrible, it's that kind of culture. Suddenly, when you're surrounded by people threatening you, it becomes very unsafe. When your parish on a Sunday morning liturgy, someone infiltrates it and starts taking pictures of everybody, you feel very unsafe. You think, what am I going to do? Are they going to vandalize the church? Are they going to do something worse? Are they going to threaten the parishioners? Are they going to spread false rumors about me? Because I bet they have a file on me. Since the passing of the national security law, my friends some of them have wiped their Facebook. 2 people have contacted me for spiritual support that I've never met from Hong Kong. Now I can't write, I'm afraid to write emails to them. I'm afraid to say anything. My emails are now, every so often I say, praying for you, and a very obscure Bible verse, hoping that whoever state agent, secret police won't be able to figure out what I'm really talking about. So it's easy to be, it doesn't take much to intimidate us, to threaten us. But in the end, after prayer, our choice is, we cannot abandon my friends, my cantors, the persecuted people, the threatened people in Hong Kong. And ultimately, you can't betray Christ for a church roof and a church wall. You have to just face the fear and keep on doing what you're doing. And let me just finish with little surprising bit of spiritual grace that I received. Last February, I was in Ukraine, in Kyiv, at our seminary, giving a retreat to the seminarians. And I happened to be there on the seminary's feast day. So the patriarch came with the auxiliary bishops, and it was a huge, hierarchical liturgy. In the middle of the sermon, all in Ukrainian, suddenly the patriarch turns around, starts speaking in English to me. And in front of everybody, in front of like international TV, this is what he said. Father Richard, please convey to your parishioners in Vancouver that the Chinese are part of our church. Our church, so he's talking about the Ukrainian Byzantine Catholic Church, our church is a mother church for them. Their sorrows, their hopes for their homeland in Hong Kong is part of our concern and our prayer. Please convey to them the heartful embrace of the Mother Church in Kyiv. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Richard. It's interesting, just as you began that, the Angelus bell started to ring at the church next to me here in Ottawa. So well, that's something. So I'd like to now just open up for some discussion as we sort of wind down these next sort of 15 minutes or so. And one thing that has come up obliquely in some ways, but maybe more directly from some of our participants who are joining us for the webinar this evening, and that is there a different situation on the ground currently in Hong Kong when it comes to the degree of restrictions on religious practice compared to mainland China? Ben, maybe you could comment on that. It's been brought up a couple of times, but maybe you could give us a sense of the lay of the land.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think it is still true to say that there is a difference of degrees in terms of religious freedom in Hong Kong compared to the mainland. Churches in Hong Kong are not being destroyed or closed. Crosses are not being torn down. Pastors and clergy are not being jailed yet. But I would say that as overall freedom in general in Hong Kong has been eroded and dismantled in recent years, and particularly with this new national security law that was imposed on Hong Kong by Beijing in July, I think that it is only a matter of time, because when freedom itself is dismantled, religious freedom, of course, will be affected. And I think I think further down the line, what we may see is not necessarily restrictions on freedom of worship in the way that we see in mainland China, maybe not for some time to come. But I think we are very likely to see other interferences with religious freedom, particularly, for example, the monitoring of sermons and clergy who preach sermons on themes like justice and human rights and freedom may find themselves on the wrong side of the law. Churches that in the anti-extradition protests last year and in the umbrella movement, and I was incredibly moved by what Father Richard shared, churches that for example, had candlelit vigils or opened their doors for protesters to give them shelter or to give them water, they may find, either retrospectively because of what they did then, or in the future if they do similar activities, they may find themselves in trouble. And if I may just very briefly to conclude, I mentioned in my opening remarks the very troubling signs of pressure coming from within the diocese on Catholics in Hong Kong, and I think there have been similar signs from the Anglican Church. The outgoing Anglican Archbishop has been very close to the government and very supportive of the national security law. But in the Catholic Church, there have been a number of cases recently where, for example, a group of lay Catholics had, because of a call for prayer by Cardinal Charles Bo, the Cardinal of Myanmar, who's the president of the Federation of Asian Bishops and who I work with very closely. Cardinal Bo had issued a call for prayer for Hong Kong, and a group of lay Hong Kong Catholics took up that call for prayer and planned to have an advertising campaign in newspapers urging people to pray. The diocese basically shut that down and said, in effect, they banned a prayer, which for a diocese to ban a prayer is extraordinary. They also, Cardinal John Tong issued a pastoral letter to all clergy saying the phrase, watch your words in your homilies, and basically telling people not to upset the government in their homilies. Similarly, Catholic schools have had instructions to teach patriotic education. That obviously means love of party, and to put restrictions in place on their students from preventing them from participating in protests. So I think we're already seeing those things. I think we'll see more of that kind of thing. Freedom to worship on a Sunday may not be affected for some time, but religious freedom in these other ways, I think already is and will continue to be.
On the Sino-Vatican agreement, Ben, you wrote a very powerful piece in Foreign Policy last week that linked the approach that the Holy See is taking with the renewal of the agreement to Pope Francis' latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. Very powerful statement there, and I would encourage people to read that. But I wanted to, one question was raised in the Q&A on this call, and that is, it seems that the Sino-Vatican agreement seems to hearken back to other missteps, grave missteps by the Secretariat of State historically in misjudging geopolitical situations and misjudging the willingness of certain powers to give the church room to maneuver. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Ostpolitik of the Secretariat of State during the Cold War, trying to curry favor with the Russians, as they continue to do in various ways. And then certainly someone in the Q&A in this chat raised the concordat between the Vatican and Nazi Germany. Is this maybe a misplaced, again, desire to hope that, well, maybe we can just carve out a little bit of space so that we can continue to we continue to engage in China, we can continue to maneuver, and we can somehow protect our interests. And I want to, before maybe Ben comments, I want to just go to you, David, as a diplomat, as a former diplomat. You would have been familiar with all of these historical examples. What's your sense maybe of, obviously, how faulty a strategy that is?
You know, it's something I won't answer as a diplomat, but as a Catholic. And I was struck by Kevin's comments about the growth of the Christian community in China. And one of the things that the Catholic Church at its best does is remembers that it is, its mission in the world is to save souls and to bring them to the love of Christ. And one of the worst things it does as an institution is to set that aside and focus on political ends to protect things that are important. The church doesn't want to endanger Catholics. We get that, but they forget often that their primary message is the individual human beings and the faithful, not states or larger organizations. I had the great and wonderful opportunity to welcome Cardinal Zen, the courageous Cardinal of Hong Kong, who's been such an outspoken champion of human freedom, to meet our students at the University of St. Michael's College. We had a great discussion with him, and he spoke directly to these students and inspired them. One of the most moving experiences I had as a diplomat was way back when in Shanghai in the mid-'80s. I had the opportunity to go and to meet Ignatius Cardinal Kung, who had just been in 1986, I think it was, had just been released into a form of house arrest, but released from prison after 30 years in prison. And what had happened to him was that, in the wake of the communist takeover in the late 40s and into the early 50s, as the communists began to turn their attentions to breaking up the religious organizations that had existed previously, he was snatched up and he was taken to a sports stadium in Shanghai, and a microphone was put in front of him, and he was asked to really repudiate the church and to repeat the propaganda of the state. And he said two things. He said, "Long live Christ the King, and long live the Pope." And for that, he spent 30 years in prison. But his personal witness and testimony inevitably, certainly did more to keep alive in the hearts of Chinese people a sense of hope and fidelity and connectedness. It's this that the church should offer, not a misplaced diplomacy that sees as their prime audience the Politburo and not the faithful. So this is what is so distressing. It's a mistake that the church at its institutional worst makes. But I also believe, and as Kevin and Father Richard have reminded us, that the Holy Spirit is at work, and that these periods, these discouraging and depressing periods, are followed by periods of hope. But it's reaching out to the people that is the church's first evangelical objective.
Ben, did you want to chime in on that, or Kevin, or Father Richard?
Well, if I may just briefly, I agree with everything that David has just said. And I think that if you look at the periods of history that this has been compared with, if you look at where in the Cold War, where the church stayed strong, probably the best example was the church in Poland. Because I don't think it's any coincidence that was where the church spoke out and resisted the communism so strongly. And I think it was one of the most vivid images of recent weeks that was truly heartbreaking. I'm not sure which is worse, the agreement itself or this incident, but it symbolized the tragedy of all of this, was the sight of Cardinal Zen, who I also have the privilege of having met a number of times, and he's a hero of mine, making what he described as possibly his last visit to Rome in the hope of trying to see the Holy Father. And this image of him with a little sort of backpack on his, or rucksack on his back, alone in St. Peter's Square, and the Pope wouldn't even give him half an hour. And even from a pastoral point of view, even if it was a private closed-door meeting, even if the Pope wasn't persuaded by Cardinal Zen's arguments, at least to give him half an hour would have been the minimum right thing to do. And it's a tragedy that not even that could happen.
Just Father Richard.
So maybe just add a couple points. In Hong Kong, the situation is, what if the threat is so real, and they're already setting up like face recognition cameras, self-censorship is because you're really afraid and you don't know what's going to happen, and so you are like super careful. And even here in the Vancouver area, I'm not just afraid for my friends in Hong Kong. I'm afraid of people there or in China associated with my church who come to me, who listen to my retreats, and because even though I may be talking purely interior spiritual life, it doesn't take much of an internet church to say, oh yeah, that guy, that church, they're involved in this kind of stuff. We'll go after the people who totally unpolitically follow him on other things. The other question is the question of credibility. So Father Deacon Andrew, our church, as you say, is a martyr church. We stood strong and got basically almost wiped out. But post, God resuscitated us, God resurrected us. And even though we're a small church in Ukraine, we punch far above our weight because of the witness that we gave in those prisons and in those death camps. That can't be dismissed. And we have this credibility and forced to do good and speak out and be believable, as opposed to churches that have compromised. The gospel says, what can you trade for your soul? You can, if you gain the world and you lose your soul, what's the point of that?
Well, I think that's a good note on which to end. We've come to the end of our time together. Would that we could have another 15 minutes or half an hour just to further explore some of these questions, but I'm conscious of our guests' time and also for all those good people that have registered for this webinar. So I'd like to pass it back over to David Sweet for a final word of farewell. So thanks very much to all of you. David.
Well, Father Deacon Andrew Bennett, and on behalf of all the participants, thank you to the Cardus Religious Freedom Institute for hosting this and bringing this to us. I want to also tell the participants, if you need some good data, that there's been years and years of this little subcommittee on Parliament Hill called the Subcommittee for International Human Rights that has done some great work, and we've interviewed hundreds of witnesses and have a number of studies that you may find very valuable for the work that you do. So please, it's free for your access. All you have to do is access the parliamentary library, and you'll be able to obtain that. Father Richard, there is some big concern, by the way, in the government of Canada, the broader Parliament of Canada, in regards to operatives in Canada that are, really funded by the CCP, and that's a big concern for us. But on the final note, in all the darkness that we always see in religious freedom and human rights, and we see much of it, there's many regimes like that of Xi Jinping's around the world. I think I'd like to finish on Kevin Garrett's comments that anybody who spent 779 days in jail and says to me that we need to be hopeful, that the Lord Jesus Christ is still the King and still looks after his church, then I think that's all of us need to be mindful of that as we work through these very tough things where lives are in the breach. But God knows that as well, and so we commit all those people who are fighting to prayer. And again, thank you to Benedict Rogers and David Mulrooney. Great information, and God bless you, and have a great night, folks.
God.
Thank you very much.